They went to the Amazon just to relax with friends and film a few videos about the wild Dot. But beneath their feet was a hidden underground hatch. Dot. What they saw inside shocked the entire world. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The afternoon sun hovered like a pale disk above the canopy. Its light filtered into greenish layers through the dense ceiling of the Amazon forest. The air was thick with moisture, alive with the drone of insects and the distant murmur of unseen rivers. When the small boat finally nudged the wooden pier of Santa Arena, a remote riverside settlement that rarely appeared on any map, the 6 travelers exhaled in a mix of fatigue and disbelief. They had been on the water for nearly half a day, and the heat felt almost alive, pressing into their skin as if testing their resolve before letting them step onto solid ground. It was the end of June, and for each of them, this journey marked the closing of one life and the uncertain threshold of another. Malik was the first to jump ashore, stretching his arms as if embracing the jungle itself. His backpack hung heavy with geological tools, a reminder of his methodical temperament. Behind him, Catherine adjusted the camera slung around her neck, brushing away a strand of hair already plastered to her forehead by the humidity. She squinted at the surroundings, half artist and half observer, looking for a frame that could summarize the chaos of color and texture around her. The others followed. Lucas, who carried 2 cases of sample jars and notebooks, Amy, whose phone was already out, capturing everything for the travel vlog she swore would finally go viral. Dylan, calm and precise, pulling out a laminated map. And Carter, the unspoken leader, who carried himself with quiet authority that seemed natural rather than assumed. They had once been classmates, bound by years of shared adolescence and rivalry, and now, after graduation, they had promised one last adventure before scattering into the currents of adult life. Some were headed for jobs, others for further studies abroad, and 1 or 2, like Amy, had no clear destination except the next story. When Carter suggested a trip to the Amazon, a real expedition rather than a tourist package, they had laughed at first. But the more he spoke of remote trails, forgotten research sites, and the chance to make one last collective memory, the more irresistible the idea became. Now, as they unloaded their gear under the watchful eyes of a few villagers, the weight of that decision began to settle. The place looked untouched by modern time. Wooden huts on stilts, smoke curling from clay chimneys, barefoot children watching them curiously, and a narrow path that vanished into the green abyss. Their hired guide, a lean man named Raphael, met them at the dock, his expression unreadable. He spoke little English, but understood enough to point the way, and gesture toward the forest with a faint smile that might have been warning or encouragement. They spent the evening assembling their equipment: ropes, rations, machetes, a first aid kit, solar lamps, and a compact drone that Dylan treated as if it were made of glass. The group dynamic resurfaced quickly. Malik argued about logistics, Lucas checked every water filter twice, Amy teased him while filming, Catherine documented the preparation in long, careful shots, and Carter ensured that everyone had a role. When the sun dipped, the jungle came alive with sound, a ceaseless orchestra of frogs, birds, and unseen creatures that echoed across the water. They ate in silence for a while, each lost in private thought, aware that the following days would carry them far beyond comfort and routine. By dawn, the air was heavy with mist. They started their trek upriver along a trail that Raphael knew from previous research teams. He warned them about the heat and the sudden rains, and they nodded, half listening, too absorbed in the novelty of their surroundings. The jungle was a cathedral of motion and decay, every inch alive. Vines looped like serpents from trees thick enough to swallow a man, and moss-covered roots rose like bones from the soil. The smell was intoxicating, a blend of rot, sweetness, and damp earth that reminded Malik of laboratory samples multiplied into infinity. Catherine paused often, taking photos that captured sunlight filtering through giant leaves or droplets trembling on spider webs the size of her arm. Amy narrated into her phone, describing the green lungs of the planet with the enthusiasm of someone chasing an audience more than an experience. Lucas examined plants, whispering their Latin names under his breath. Dylan checked his GPS, muttering about signal loss. Carter, walking last, noticed the trail narrowing and the forest pressing in like a wall. By noon, the humidity became unbearable. Sweat dripped from their foreheads, and their clothes clung to their skin. Raphael motioned for a rest near a clearing where fallen logs formed a crude bench. As they sat, Malik wandered a little further, searching for dry soil to test his small geological probe. The instrument barely sank an inch before hitting something unusually solid. He frowned, brushed away the top layer of earth, and felt the edge of what seemed to be stone. A pattern emerged, a faint line, almost straight. His curiosity sharpened. He called Dylan, who came over with cautious precision, brushing the surface with his hands. It was stone, but not natural. The angle was too perfect, the surface too smooth. They began removing more soil, revealing the corner of a massive block perhaps a meter deep in the ground. Raphael watched them in silence, his brow furrowing. Catherine crouched, taking a close photo, and the camera lens caught the faint reflection of some kind of greenish residue, like oxidized copper. The others gathered around, forming a half circle of disbelief. "What do you think it is?" Amy asked softly, though the tone of her voice was already that of someone narrating a future video clip. No one answered. Malik leaned closer, tracing the line with his fingers. "Not natural," he murmured. Dylan agreed. The shape suggested deliberate carving, perhaps part of a larger structure beneath. Lucas speculated that it might be the remnants of an old research base buried after decades of erosion. Carter didn't speak. He simply took a mental note of the coordinates and told everyone to cover it up for now. They would return later with better tools. As the daylight waned, the forest temperature dropped slightly, and mist began to creep from the undergrowth. They pitched their tents on higher ground near a small stream. The air smelled of damp leaves and smoke from their cooking fire. Over dinner, conversation circled back to the discovery. Malik wanted to investigate immediately. Dylan urged caution, warning that the ground could be unstable. Lucas suggested it might have archaeological significance, perhaps linked to pre-Columbian ruins. Amy saw an opportunity for viral fame. Catherine stayed quiet but kept glancing at her camera, reviewing the images she had captured earlier. In one, the pattern on the stone almost resembled carvings, curved lines like waves or intertwined vines. Raphael listened, then spoke in his slow Portuguese-inflected English. He mentioned that years ago, a foreign expedition had passed through this area, looking for mineral samples in something he called the Forgotten Vault. They had disappeared after a storm. The villagers said their camp was later found abandoned, with the earth swallowed by mudslides. He shrugged afterward, as if dismissing his own story, but his eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. When night fully descended, the jungle became an ocean of noise. Bats swooped through the trees, and somewhere far off, a howler monkey let out a cry that sounded almost human. Amy's laughter faded. The others retreated into their tents. Only Carter stayed awake, sitting by the fire with his notebook open, sketching the layout of the area as he remembered it. He had been in enough dangerous places during his volunteer work to recognize the subtle unease that creeps in before discovery. There was something beneath them, something that didn't belong. Before sleeping, Malik walked quietly to the edge of the clearing and shone his flashlight once more at the spot where they had found the stone. The beam revealed nothing but disturbed earth. Yet the ground seemed slightly different, softer, almost as if something underneath had shifted after they left. He knelt, placed his palm against the soil, and thought he felt a faint vibration, like air trapped beneath pressure. But when he listened closer, there was only the rustle of insects. He returned to the tent uneasy. The night grew thicker. From somewhere across the stream, a branch snapped. Carter heard it too, but said nothing. He simply stoked the fire, the flames catching the brief glint of metal from the nearby tools. In that small circle of light, their gear cast shadows that looked like the outlines of forgotten monuments. At dawn, the mist lay heavy again, veiling the forest floor. They woke to the croak of unseen frogs and the rhythmic pulse of water dripping from leaves. Breakfast was quick. Coffee from a tin, a few energy bars, quiet exchanges of plans. The air carried the excitement of unfinished business. Malik insisted they return to the site immediately. Dylan double-checked the structural integrity of the ground using a handheld sensor. Raphael hesitated but eventually nodded. The trail back felt shorter in the morning haze. When they reached the spot, the earth where they had dug seemed oddly disturbed, as if the jungle itself had rearranged it during the night. Malik began to clear it again, and this time the outline was unmistakable, a large, rectangular surface buried under compacted soil. Catherine lifted her camera, the shutter clicking like a heartbeat. The others watched in silence, caught between thrill and apprehension. The sun rose higher, turning the leaves into mirrors of light. Sweat glistened on their faces as they worked. Bit by bit, the shape revealed itself, smooth, flat, with traces of carbons and a faint metallic hue. The jungle's chorus seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by the scrape of metal against stone. When they finally stood back, breathless, they realized the truth of what lay before them, a monumental structure, sealed and forgotten, waiting for someone reckless enough to open it. No one spoke. Even Amy lowered her phone. The light shimmered across the strange green surface as though something beneath had caught the sun's reflection. For a brief second, they all felt the same quiet pulse of realization. Whatever this was, it had been hidden for a reason. And tomorrow they would find out why. The evening that followed was tense, filled with half-finished thoughts and unspoken fears. They ate quickly, extinguished the fire earlier than usual, and retreated into their tents. Only the jungle stayed awake, whispering its ancient language through the leaves. Far above them, unseen stars blinked through the canopy like the eyes of watchful sentinels. Before sleep took them, each of them sensed it in their own way, the knowledge that tomorrow would divide their lives into before and after. The ground beneath them was not silent. It carried the memory of hands that had buried something too important to be found. The expedition had only just begun, and already the forest seemed to hold its breath. When the last ember faded, Carter's voice, barely audible, broke the silence within his own thoughts. Tomorrow we dig. And somewhere in the darkness, beneath layers of ancient soil, something unseen waited, indifferent to who would come next. Morning arrived heavy with mist, a pale gray shroud that muffled the sound of the waking forest. The air smelled of wet leaves and soil, and the cries of distant macaws echoed like faint warnings. Carter was the first to rise, unzipping his tent and breathing in the thick air that clung to everything. He felt the pressure of the day before it even began. The discovery of the stone surface had changed the tone of their journey completely. The laughter from the first day was gone, replaced by an unspoken urgency, a feeling that they had stumbled upon something that demanded answers. He brewed the first pot of coffee while the others stirred, their movements sluggish, but their eyes alert. By the time the fog thinned, they were already moving toward the site. Malik carried the small digging tools, his expression focused and almost reverent, while Dylan adjusted the straps of his equipment pack, double-checking every latch and bolt. Catherine followed behind, her camera swinging gently against her chest. She recorded fragments of the trail, the dripping leaves, the muddy footprints, the slow passage of their group like a line of ghosts moving through the morning haze. Lucas and Amy came last, whispering about the strange carvings they had seen on the surface the day before. Raphael led the way in silence, machete in hand, cutting through the vines that had already begun reclaiming the path they had cleared. When they reached the clearing, the ground looked unchanged at first glance, but Malik noticed subtle differences. The edges of the pit they had dug seemed softer, as if something had disturbed them. He knelt and touched the soil. It was damp but warm, and the color had deepened overnight. He exchanged a quick glance with Dylan, who shrugged and handed him a small brush. Together, they began to clear away the mud. Within minutes, the shape reappeared beneath the thin veil of earth, the smooth, deliberate plane of stone, larger than any of them had realized. Catherine began to take photos again, though her hands trembled slightly with anticipation. The group worked in near silence, broken only by the scrape of tools and the murmur of the forest. The stone extended farther than expected, its surface patterned with faint lines, perhaps decorative carvings, perhaps cracks from age. Dylan examined the perimeter and noticed the faint seam running along one edge, a boundary line, precise and mechanical. He tapped it lightly with his tool. The sound was not hollow, but neither was it solid. Somewhere beneath, the tone shifted, a low resonance like a muffled echo. It was enough to confirm that this was not a monolith buried by chance, but something intentionally sealed. Raphael backed away, his face tightening. "This is not old," he said softly, his voice carrying through the still air. "Not ancient stone. This was made not long ago." His words hung between them, heavy with implication. Malik looked up, frowning. "But why bury something so deep?" he asked, mostly to himself. No one answered. Carter motioned for them to keep working. The ground trembled slightly as Dylan used the small crowbar to loosen one corner. They lifted the first section free with cautious strength, revealing a thin layer of compacted clay beneath. Then another metallic reflection, dull, industrial gray this time. They froze. Beneath the stone layer lay a metal plate, its surface scratched and discolored. Catherine lowered her camera and crouched beside Dylan, her breath quick. "It's a hatch," he said, brushing off the clay. A handle emerged, rusted but intact. Whoever built this wanted it to stay hidden. Malik ran his fingers along the edge, feeling the precision of the join. "It's no older than 50 years, he murmured. "Probably less." Carter straightened and looked around the clearing. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the insects were holding back. He nodded to Dylan. "Open it." It took several attempts. The handle resisted, groaning like something that hadn't been touched in decades. Finally, with a sharp metallic snap, it gave way. The hinges squealed. A puff of stale, warm air escaped, carrying with it the smell of earth, oil, and something faintly organic. The moment the hatch opened, Catherine instinctively stepped back, covering her mouth. Malik turned on his flashlight and shone it down into the darkness below. The beam revealed a smooth shaft descending perhaps 3 meters, ending on what looked like another sealed door. Ladders of corroded metal ran along the side. Dylan was the first to move. He tied a rope to a nearby tree, securing it as a backup, and began to climb down carefully, his boots scraping the wall. Malik followed after him, flashlight in hand, the light cutting arcs through the dust that swirled up with every movement. At the bottom, they found a second hatch, this one horizontal, bolted shut but easier to manipulate. Together, they forced it open, and a dull clang echoed upward. The smell intensified, oil, chemicals, and something living. When they pushed the door wide enough to crawl through, the beam of light spilled across the interior of a small underground chamber. It wasn't a tomb, nor was it an ancient vault. The walls were reinforced with concrete, the ceiling lined with metal pipes. Dust-covered crates were stacked along one side, and in the center, resting on a raised platform, was a large steel container. Its surface was dented but intact, and along its edge ran fresh marks, recent scratches, as if someone had tried to open it not long ago. Malik's voice broke the silence. "This is no archaeological site." Dylan nodded grimly. "More like a cache." He touched the corner of the container, feeling the faint vibration of a working pressure seal. Someone buried this to hide it. When they pried open the outer latch, a hiss escaped, followed by a wave of heavy, damp air. Inside were smaller boxes and sealed plastic cases. Malik opened one carefully, and his breath caught. Tiny glass enclosures lined with straw, each containing small, pale creatures, lizards, frogs, and insects, still alive but weak, their movements sluggish. Another box held plant samples, roots wrapped in damp cloth, the labels written in Portuguese and Latin. Catherine knelt beside them, her camera forgotten for the first time. Lucas arrived, eyes wide with disbelief. "These are protected species," he whispered, reaching carefully toward one container. "Some of these have been considered extinct in the wild. This is a legal collection. Contraband." Amy's voice trembled as she spoke. "So, this isn't a tomb. It's a smuggler's hide." Malik nodded slowly. "They must have used this place decades ago, maybe even recently. The structure looks modern enough." He pointed to the serial codes etched on the sides of several crates. Organized, systematic. Whoever ran this operation knew what they were doing. Carter crouched by another case, prying it open with the edge of his knife. Inside were vials of seeds and labeled envelopes. He turned one over and read the inscription: Amazonica Sites Prohibited, 1973. He exhaled sharply. "It's not just animals," he said. "They were smuggling genetic material, seeds, roots, embryos, probably for labs or private buyers." The realization spread through the group like a slow, cold current. The expedition that had vanished years ago might not have been lost to storms at all. They might have been silenced. Raphael stood near the entrance, his knuckles white around the handle of his machete. He whispered something under his breath, a prayer or a curse. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, its sounds pressing against the edge of the chamber. They began documenting everything. Dylan mapped the structure, Catherine photographed each box, and Lucas cataloged the visible species as best he could. Malik found a weathered notebook wedged behind one of the crates. Its pages were brittle, filled with dates, coordinates, and coded notes about deliveries. One line stood out: Shipment 12 relocation under risk of discovery. Seal and move before inspection. The date was barely 10 years old. Amy's camera light flickered across the far wall, revealing something odd. A long crack, fresh and irregular, running from floor to ceiling, seemed to pulse faintly as air leaked through. Dylan examined it and found a thin layer of soil on the other side. "This isn't stable," he said. "If the rains come again, this chamber could collapse." Carter frowned, glancing toward the hatch above. "Then we need to finish quickly." Hours passed as they worked, carefully recording everything while trying not to disturb the delicate balance of the place. The animals inside the glass containers twitched weakly, their breath fogging the surface. Lucas tried to hydrate one of the frogs with drops of water from his canteen, and the creature stirred, its skin regaining a hint of color. "They've been kept alive just enough to survive transport," he muttered. "It's horrific." As the day wore on, the air inside grew stifling. The faint hum of insects from above mixed with the mechanical echo of their movements. Catherine caught sight of fresh footprints in the dust, boot marks that were not theirs, leading from the entrance toward the central crate and then back. She called Carter over, and they exchanged a tense glance. Someone else had been here recently, perhaps days ago. Raphael climbed halfway down the ladder and called softly, "The sun is fallen. We should leave before night." But the group hesitated, torn between caution and curiosity. Amy, restless and sweating, paced near the open hatch. "We can't just leave it," she said. "If this belongs to traffickers, they'll come back for it." Malik nodded. "And if we take anything, we'll be the ones they blame." Carter finally made the decision. They would document the entire site tonight and decide what to do in the morning. They couldn't risk moving the animals now, not without proper containers. Dylan agreed reluctantly and sealed the outer hatch to keep the humidity steady. They climbed out one by one, their clothes streaked with mud, their minds racing. Back at the camp, the evening light turned the river gold, and the forest hummed with the life they had just seen imprisoned underground. Dinner was quiet. Amy stared at her phone screen but didn't record anything. Lucas sat with his journal open, sketching the containers they'd found, trying to recall the names on each label. Catherine uploaded her photos to her laptop, her expression caught between awe and dread. Malik sat apart, his notebook open to a page of calculations, oxygen levels, soil depth, the probability that the hatch could have been opened within the last year. As the darkness deepened, the forest's rhythm returned. Yet every sound, the cry of a night bird, the rustle of branches, felt closer, sharper. Raphael patrolled the edge of the camp, uneasy. He had seen the same kind of hidden caches before, he said quietly, years ago in another region. "People who use the jungle this way," he muttered. "They never leave it empty for long." Carter looked out toward the tree line, his face lit by the last embers of the fire. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, the need to protect his friends, the animals, and whatever truth lay beneath that hatch. He didn't yet know which would prove harder. Before they retreated into their tents, the group gathered briefly around the map Dylan had laid out. The coordinates of the site glowed faintly under the flashlight. Carter drew a small circle around them and wrote a single word beside it: "Cache." Then he folded the map carefully and tucked it away. Sleep did not come easily. The night was alive with motion, the crack of branches, the distant hum of a boat engine somewhere downriver, the shifting whisper of leaves against canvas. Catherine dreamed of cages opening in slow motion, of wings fluttering in the dark. Lucas woke once to the faint echo of a metallic clang, as if something below the earth had shifted again. He listened for a long time, but the sound did not return. By the time dawn broke, the mist had returned thicker than before, curling low across the ground. Carter stepped outside and saw fresh prints in the soft soil leading toward the trail, boot prints larger than any of theirs. He followed them to the edge of the clearing before they vanished into the trees. Somewhere out there, someone else knew about the buried chamber. He tightened his grip on the map and whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "We're not alone out here." Behind him, the others began to stir, unaware of the silent tracks that told the jungle's newest secret. The cache had not been abandoned. It had only been interrupted. And now, by uncovering it, they had entered into a story far more dangerous than the one they had planned to tell. The day began with a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the forest were holding its breath. The mist hung thicker than before, turning the clearing into a ghostly hollow of pale light and dripping leaves. Carter crouched by the spot where he had found the footprints, tracing their edges with his fingers. The impressions were fresh, the heel marks sharp, the depth clear. Whoever had been there had walked through only hours earlier. The prints were large, heavy, and led away toward the river. He followed them a few steps into the undergrowth before they vanished in the mud. When he returned to camp, the others were already awake, moving about in tense silence. No one needed to ask if he had seen them too. The unease was shared, visible in the stiffness of every motion. They ate breakfast without appetite. Amy stirred her coffee mechanically, her usual chatter gone. Malik checked his tools, though he wasn't really focused on the task. Lucas leafed through his notebook, but the pages blurred in his vision. Catherine cleaned the lens of her camera with methodical precision, pretending that concentration could silence her thoughts. Only Dylan seemed outwardly composed, though the muscles in his jaw worked constantly, as if he were clenching back words. Raphael, standing at the edge of the camp, scanned the forest with eyes that missed nothing. He looked older that morning, as if the jungle had drawn something from him overnight. When Carter spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. They were not alone. The prints were proof that someone else had been near the site since they left. He told them to stay close, to avoid wandering even a few meters from camp. Amy asked if they should move to another location, but Malik shook his head. The find was too important, and abandoning it now would mean losing any chance of understanding what they had uncovered. Lucas agreed, though his tone betrayed doubt. "If they were here last night," he said, "they already know we've opened the hatch. Leaving won't erase that." Carter looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Then we make sure we stay ahead of them." The morning passed in strained quiet. The sounds of insects and birds seemed distant, as if the forest had shifted just out of reach. When the sun broke through, the heat returned with vengeance, and sweat slicked their faces as they retraced the path to the excavation site. The air smelled faintly of iron and decay. As they approached, Malik stopped abruptly. The rope they had tied to the nearby tree was gone. The hatch was still sealed, but fresh tool marks lined its edge, thin scratches that hadn't been there before. Someone had tried to open it again, perhaps during the night, perhaps at dawn. Dylan knelt beside the hatch examining the marks. They had tools, he said, probably a crowbar, but they stopped halfway. He touched the metal. It was still cool, That meant the attempt hadn't been recent, at least not within the last hour. Carter motioned for everyone to stay alert while Malik checked the perimeter. There were other signs, too. Trampled leaves, an extinguished cigarette butt half buried in mud, and the faint smell of fuel. Whoever these people were, they weren't amateurs. The group gathered around the hatch, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Catherine finally broke the silence. "If they come back," she said softly, "they won't just want to open it. They'll want to remove everything and anyone in their way." Amy swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. "So, what do we do?" Carter's reply was steady. "We go back down. We document everything fast. If we have proof of what's inside, we can't just be dismissed as trespassers. If they destroy it afterward, at least the evidence will remain." Raphael looked uneasy but didn't argue. The hatch opened with the same low groan as before, the air rising from below damp and heavy. Malik descended first, followed by Dylan and Carter. The beam of their flashlights cut through the dimness, revealing the metal walls, the crates, and the central container where the animals still stirred faintly. Lucas followed, clutching his notebook. The deeper air felt different now, charged, almost electric with tension, the smell of oil mixed with the faint scent of decay. Malik checked the readings on his portable gauge. Oxygen levels were lower than before, but still safe. They moved quickly, opening more boxes. Inside one, Catherine found several sealed bags of dried herbs labeled with scientific names. Another contained vials filled with clear fluid and suspended roots. Malik noticed the dates, some as recent as 2 years ago. "This place was active until recently," he murmured. "Maybe even last season." Lucas ran his hand along one of the containers and found a faint smear of red clay. "That type of soil isn't from this area," he said. "Whoever brought this here traveled from deep inland." Amy, standing near the entrance, suddenly froze. "Someone's up there," she whispered. The others stopped moving. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Then they heard it. A faint scrape, metal against metal from above. Carter switched off his flashlight, and the darkness closed around them. They waited. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable creak of the hatch. Raphael's voice drifted faintly from above, calling Carter's name. Carter exhaled and answered. "It's clear," Raphael said. "No one around. I thought I heard something, but it was just the wind." The tension broke slightly, but none of them fully believed it. They continued working, but every sound seemed amplified, every breath too loud. Catherine took photographs of the crates, focusing on the serial codes and labels. Malik and Lucas cataloged the living specimens, noting which were viable and which had already perished. Dylan worked on tracing the origin of the wiring along the walls, realizing that it led to a small control box near the corner. Inside were old batteries, corroded but clearly once part of a power supply. "They had refrigeration down here," he said. "Whatever this operation was, it needed temperature control." Carter found another notebook wedged behind a crate, this one more recent. The paper yellowed but intact. He flipped through the pages, frowning at the mixture of English and Portuguese. Most of it was logistical data, dates, initials, coded instructions, but one entry stood out. "Inspection delayed due to patrol interference. Locals suspected. Secure the vault and wait for pickup." The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged. At the bottom of the page was a date, just 5 months ago. He looked up at the others. "They're still active," he said quietly, "and they know people come through this area. We have to assume they're watching." Catherine stopped photographing and lowered her camera. The reality settled over them like the humidity in the air. This wasn't a forgotten cache. It was part of an ongoing network, one that wouldn't take kindly to outsiders exposing it. By late afternoon, they emerged again, blinking against the harsh light. The forest around them shimmered with heat, and clouds were gathering in the distance, thick and heavy with the promise of rain. Raphael urged them to return to camp before dark. The trail back felt longer, the forest more oppressive. Every sound behind them seemed to echo too closely. Amy kept glancing over her shoulder. Once, she swore she saw movement among the trees, a flicker of color that didn't belong, but when she turned there was only the green stillness. When they reached camp, Carter noticed something immediately wrong. The tents had been disturbed. One was partially unzipped, the contents of another scattered across the ground. Their food supplies were intact, but the drone Dylan had left charging was gone. So were several of Catherine's memory cards. Malik cursed under his breath. They've been here. Raphael scanned the perimeter and found fresh footprints near the edge of the clearing. 2, maybe 3 men, he said. They came from the west, not from the river. Carter clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout. Whoever they were, they had been close enough to watch them all day. The storm broke at dusk, sudden and violent. Rain hammered the leaves, turning the clearing into a swamp. Lightning flashed, throwing the forest into momentary stark relief. The thunder rolled so close it shook the ground beneath them. They huddled in the largest tent, the air inside thick and stifling. Catherine tried to back up the remaining photos onto her laptop, but the power flickered. Amy sat hugging her knees, trembling, her phone clasped tight in her hands. Malik stared at the floor, deep in thought. If they wanted to scare us, he said quietly, they've succeeded. When the storm finally eased, the jungle returned to its nocturnal rhythm, but something had changed in the sound, a faint, rhythmic hum that came and went. Dylan stepped outside, scanning the tree line with his flashlight. The beam caught a glint of metal for an instant, then nothing. They're still out there, he said when he returned, watching. The group spent the night in uneasy silence, each listening for the slightest disturbance. At some point, Carter heard a soft rustle near the stream, a boot stepping into shallow water, and the quiet snap of a twig. He gripped his knife but didn't move. Minutes passed before the noise faded away. By dawn, he wasn't sure whether he'd imagined it. Morning came pale and uneasy. The rain had washed away the tracks, leaving only slick mud and scattered debris. Raphael brewed a thin, bitter coffee, and they drank it without speaking. The air was heavy with exhaustion. Carter gathered them around the fire pit, now a puddle of ashes and rainwater. We can't stay here, he said. They know where we are. They've seen what we found. Malik shook his head. If we leave now, everything we've documented could vanish. They'll come, destroy the site, erase every trace. It'll be like it never existed. Lucas agreed reluctantly. If we don't stop them, this will keep happening. More animals, more plants taken. Amy lifted her head. And what happens to us if we try? She asked. They've got weapons. We've got cameras and shovels. No one answered immediately. The jungle hummed around them, indifferent to their debate. Finally, Carter said, "We make it count. If we can't fight them directly, we expose them. But first, we protect what we can. The animals, the plants, anything still alive. We get them out before anyone comes back." The decision settled over them slowly, the kind of choice that carried both courage and fear. Catherine closed her laptop and met his eyes. "Then we'll need to move fast," she said, "before nightfall." Malik nodded, his jaw tightening. Lucas packed his notes, careful not to leave a trace. Amy switched off her phone for the first time since the trip began. Dylan checked the rope, the tools, the containers. The day had barely begun, yet the sense of an ending hovered in the air. As they set out again, the forest seemed to close behind them like a curtain. The trail was slick with rain, the trees dripping with mist. Above, clouds gathered once more, and thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. They moved quickly, heads down, the weight of their decision pressing on every step. Somewhere behind them, hidden among the trees, a figure watched silently, the faint red glow of a cigarette ember burning through the fog before vanishing into the green. The cache had been found, and now the hunters would return. The rain had not stopped by morning. It came down in slow, ceaseless threads, soaking the ground and turning the path into a stretch of brown, sucking mud. The jungle seemed darker, heavier, as if the weight of the storm had pressed down the very sky. Carter woke before the others, his shirt clinging to his back, the air in the tent so thick with humidity it was difficult to breathe. For a moment, he just listened to the dripping leaves, the muffled rumble of thunder in the distance, and somewhere farther away, the sound of water rushing stronger than before. The river had swelled overnight. They were running out of time. When he stepped outside, the camp was shrouded in mist. Raphael was already awake, crouched by the remnants of the fire, coaxing a thin flame from damp kindling. Malik emerged next, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes still alive with determination. One by one, the others followed. Dylan checking his rope and tools, Catherine clutching her camera in a waterproof sleeve, Amy rubbing her arms for warmth, Lucas tying the ends of a small canvas bag that held his samples. The storm had shaken them, but not broken them. The decision made the previous day still stood. They would go back to the hatch and retrieve whatever living creatures and plant material they could before the traffickers returned. It was dangerous and desperate, but the thought of leaving those living beings to die underground was unbearable. Breakfast was quick and silent. Each of them moved with purpose, aware that they might not get another chance. Carter assigned roles without raising his voice. Dylan and Malik would handle the heavy lifting and clearing. Lucas would tend to the animals. Catherine would document everything. Amy would coordinate from above and keep a lookout. Raphael would guard the perimeter and signal if anyone approached. There were no objections. Even Amy, who had argued for leaving, now carried a quiet resolve. The rain had washed away some of her fear, leaving something steadier in its place, a grim acceptance that there was no safety left anyway. They set out as soon as the first dim light filtered through the canopy. The forest floor squelched under their boots, every step pulling at their strength. The trees loomed close, dripping and whispering in the wind. The trail they had made was half erased by mudslides, and several times they had to stop to cut through fallen branches or wade across flooded stretches. The air smelled of rot and river clay. The jungle no longer seemed alive in the same way. It felt watchful. Malik glanced back often, convinced he could hear footsteps behind them, but every time he stopped to listen, there was only rain. When they reached the clearing, the hatch stood like a dark mouth in the ground, rimmed with wet earth. The rope ladder still hung where they had left it, slick with water but intact. Carter checked the surroundings carefully. No new footprints, no sign of tools, no cigarette butts. Either the traffickers hadn't returned yet, or they were waiting. He gestured for the group to begin. Dylan tested the rope, then descended first, his boots splashing onto the metal floor below. Malik followed, flashlight in one hand, waterproof tarp in the other. Lucas and Catherine went next, then Carter. Amy stayed at the top with Raphael, her eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. The air below was thick, damp, and warmer than before. It smelled of stagnant water and oil. The beams of their flashlights slid over the walls, glinting off metal crates and the sheen of condensation. Nothing had been disturbed. The animals still moved faintly inside their glass cases, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Malik knelt by one of the containers, checking the seals. "They won't survive much longer in this air," he said softly. Lucas joined him, pulling on gloves. Together they began transferring the smaller creatures, frogs, lizards, small mammals, into portable containers lined with damp leaves. The work was delicate and slow. Each life mattered, and each second felt stolen. Dylan and Carter worked on unbolting the larger crates that held plant samples. The metal resisted them, the rusted bolts squealing under the wrench. Water dripped steadily from above, pattering on their shoulders. Catherine moved quietly between them, taking photographs of every label, every coded marking. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to keep steady. She knew these images might be the only proof they would have later. The sound of her camera shutter clicked like a heartbeat in the silence. An hour passed before the first tension broke. Amy's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie, her tone low and strained. "Movement on the west side. 2 figures near the old trail. They're not locals." Everyone froze. Carter looked up toward the open hatch, though he couldn't see the sky. "How close?" he asked. "About 200 meters and closing," Amy replied. "They're armed." The word hung in the air like a physical weight. Malik swore quietly under his breath. Dylan immediately dimmed the flashlights, leaving only a faint glow. "We have to move faster," Carter said. "Load what you can and prepare to seal the hatch. We'll take what's ready and go." They worked with renewed urgency. Malik and Lucas filled the last of the containers, sealing them with wet cloths to keep the humidity. Catherine packed her camera, slinging it over her shoulder. Dylan hoisted 2 crates toward the ladder while Carter helped Malik tie the smaller ones into bundles that could be carried on ropes. The air felt tighter, the sound of their breathing louder. Above them, the faint rumble of footsteps began to echo through the wet soil. Raphael's voice cut through the radio. "3 men now. They're circling the clearing. You have minutes." Carter felt his pulse quicken. "Get Amy out of sight," he ordered. "If anything happens, head to the river. We'll follow." Raphael didn't argue. The radio hissed once, then fell silent. The group moved like a single organism, each motion practiced though it was improvised. Dylan climbed first, hauling 1 crate at a time up the ladder. Catherine followed, pulling the smaller containers by rope. The rain outside had turned to a steady drizzle, but the sound of approaching voices, muffled, sharp, foreign, cut through it. Malik looked up at Carter. "They're almost here." Carter nodded. "Go, I'll seal it." When Malik reached the top, Carter gave one last glance around the chamber. The metallic smell, the flickering beam of the dying flashlight, the sight of the empty shelves, it all seared itself into his memory. Then he climbed quickly, pausing halfway as the first shadow crossed the clearing above. A voice barked something in Portuguese. Raphael shouted in return, loud and forceful, drawing attention away. Carter emerged into chaos. 2 men in dark clothes were advancing through the clearing. rifles slung at their sides, their movements quick and practiced. Raphael fired a warning shot into the air with his flare gun, the light bursting scarlet against the gray sky. The men ducked instinctively, shouting. Amy grabbed one of the crates and began dragging it toward the tree line, her breath ragged. Malik ran to help her, slipping in the mud. Dylan and Lucas hoisted the remaining cases between them. Catherine covered them, trying to keep the camera dry as she stumbled through the wet brush. Carter caught Raphael's arm. "This way," he shouted. They turned and plunged into the forest, the group scattering through the narrow trail they had made days ago. Behind them came the shouts of pursuit, the crack of branches, and the distant echo of a gunshot. The jungle exploded into motion, birds shrieking from the trees, monkeys howling, the rain slashing through leaves like shrapnel. The trail was treacherous. Roots snaked across the mud, catching their feet. Carter could hear Amy gasping somewhere ahead, Raphael cursing under his breath behind him. Malik stumbled but kept hold of the crate he carried, refusing to drop it even as the weight dragged him down. Lucas lagged slightly, clutching his bag of samples, the strap cutting into his shoulder. Dylan, always the pragmatist, slowed long enough to check that no one was left behind before pushing forward again. They reached a narrow ravine where a stream cut through the earth. The water was swollen from the rain, foaming and brown. Without hesitation, Carter waded in first, the current nearly knocking him off balance. "Follow me," he yelled. One by one, they splashed across, half carrying, half floating the crates. Catherine nearly slipped, her camera bag dipping into the water, but Lucas caught her arm and pulled her up. The crates bobbed like ghosts in the current. On the far side, they collapsed briefly in the mud, chests heaving, the sound of their pursuers faint but persistent behind them. Raphael crouched and scanned the trees. "They're following the trail. We can't lead them straight to the river," he said. Carter nodded. "Then we cut through here." He pointed eastward into a denser patch of jungle. "It'll slow us down, but it'll slow them more." They pushed forward, forcing their way through thickets of vines and ferns. Thorns tore at their clothes, and insects swarmed around their faces. The rain softened, replaced by the steady drip from the canopy. The forest grew darker again, the light dimming as clouds thickened overhead. Hours seemed to pass, though it was barely one. By the time they reached a small hollow beneath a cluster of buttress roots, their strength was nearly gone. They set the crates down carefully. The animals inside were still alive, though barely. Lucas began tending to them, whispering softly as he checked their breathing. Malik examined the plants, noting which ones had survived the movement. Catherine slumped against a tree, wiping mud from her face. Amy sat nearby, staring at her shaking hands. Dylan leaned against a root, panting, his shirt torn. Raphael stood watch, his hand never leaving the handle of his machete. For a brief moment, there was silence again, the kind of silence that feels earned. Carter looked around at them, these people who had begun as curious travelers and were now something else entirely. He knew the danger wasn't over, the men would not give up easily, but for now they had succeeded in what they came to do. The crates were intact, the living cargo saved. Whether they could get it out of the jungle was another question altogether. As evening fell, they moved toward the river in careful stages, avoiding the main paths. The rain began again, softer now, masking their movement. The sound of the water grew louder as they descended through the undergrowth. Finally, the muddy bank came into view, a stretch of brown current glinting faintly under the clouded sky. Their small boat, hidden among reeds and branches, was still there. Relief surged through them. They loaded the crates carefully, balancing them between the benches. Dylan checked the motor, praying the fuel had stayed dry. It sputtered once, then caught. The sound was too loud, echoing through the trees, but there was no choice now. They pushed off, the boat sliding into the current. The river carried them swiftly, winding between walls of green. Behind them, the clearing and the hidden hatch disappeared from view, swallowed again by the forest. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the motor, the slap of water against the hull, and the distant cry of night birds. Catherine looked over the crates and saw movement, a frog pressing its tiny body against the glass, breathing, alive. She felt tears rise unexpectedly. Malik met her gaze and gave a weary nod. "They'll live," he said quietly, "at least some of them." But Carter's thoughts were elsewhere. He scanned the riverbanks, alert for movement, for the glint of another boat. The traffickers would not give up. He knew that the moment they realized what had been taken, they would come. And yet, for the first time since the journey began, he felt something close to clarity. Whatever happened next, they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had chosen to act, to protect rather than to flee. As the river bent eastward, lightning flickered again on the horizon, illuminating the vast green expanse that seemed endless and alive. The jungle had tested them, consumed their strength, but it had also given them something none of them had expected, a sense of purpose. When night finally fell, they continued downstream under the shroud of darkness, their boat a small pulse of motion against the great heart of the Amazon. The crates shifted gently with the current, the faint sound of life inside them merging with the rhythm of the river. Behind them, somewhere far beyond the curve of the water, the men who had hunted them would find only the empty clearing, the sealed hatch, and the rain erasing every footprint. But by then, the rescuers would already be miles away, carrying with them the fragile breath of the creatures they had refused to abandon. The river had carried them through the night, a restless brown artery winding through the vast silence of the rainforest. By dawn, the storm had weakened into a misty drizzle, soft enough to reveal the pale light of morning creeping over the canopy. The air was thick, metallic, and smelled of wet bark and mud. The small motorboat drifted into a calmer stretch of water, and for the first time in hours, the group allowed themselves to breathe normally. They had made it out of the clearing, away from the cache and the men who had chased them, but no one dared call it safety yet. The jungle had a way of swallowing sounds and secrets alike. Nothing was ever truly gone here. Carter cut the motor and let the current take them. The silence that followed felt enormous. The sound of insects rose again, tentative at first, then steady, filling the air like static. Amy leaned over the side of the boat, scooping water into her hands to wipe the mud from her face. Her fingers trembled from exhaustion. Catherine sat near the bow, her camera tucked safely in a waterproof case at her side. Her eyes were distant, fixed on the blurred reflections of trees in the water. Malik checked the crates that held the rescued animals. A few of the smaller frogs had died overnight, their fragile bodies curled in unnatural stillness, but most of the creatures still moved weakly inside their makeshift enclosures. He touched the side of one container gently, whispering to himself in a language the others didn't know. Lucas leaned against the edge of the boat, his arm pressed against a crate of plants. His mind felt split in two, half focused on the immediate task of keeping the survivors alive, half drifting through what had happened. He still saw flashes of the clearing in his mind, the dark figures, the flare lighting up the rain, the sound of gunfire echoing across the trees. Dillon sat beside him, one hand gripping the tiller, the other resting protectively on the metal case that held the remaining samples. His usually calm face was pale now, and the sleeve of his shirt was stained dark red near the shoulder. It wasn't just mud. Carter noticed it first. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. Dillon glanced down, almost surprised, then pressed his fingers to the wound. The skin was torn where a bullet or splinter of metal must have grazed him during the escape. The bleeding wasn't heavy, but it had gone unnoticed for too long. Lucas immediately reached into the pack beside him and pulled out the first aid kit. "You should have said something," he muttered, though there was no anger in his voice. Dillon shrugged, wincing. Didn't want to slow anyone down. Malik took over, cleaning the wound with disinfectant. The smell of alcohol mixed with the jungle's damp musk. Dillon clenched his jaw but didn't make a sound. When the bandage was wrapped and secure, Carter placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You didn't slow us down. You kept us moving. Don't forget that." By midday, the river narrowed into a quieter tributary that Raphael recognized. He signaled to the right, guiding them toward a cluster of stilted wooden huts nearly hidden behind the wall of vegetation. Smoke rose from one of the huts, thin and white. The village was small, maybe 20 families at most, built on the edge of a flooded plain. The people here traded with passing boats, but rarely saw outsiders like them. When the group disembarked, the villagers watched from their doorways, curious but wary. Raphael spoke to an older man in rapid Portuguese, explaining their need for shelter, medical help, and privacy. The man nodded slowly and gestured toward a larger hut at the edge of the village. Inside, the air was cool and shadowed. The floorboards creaked softly as they entered. Malik and Lucas carried in the crates and began setting them on a long table. Catherine wiped her hands and began opening the lids one by one, checking the animal's condition. Lucas's voice turned clinical, low and precise. "Hydration first. Don't try to feed them yet. Keep the humidity steady." Malik nodded and began filling small bowls with water from his canteen, while Amy tore strips from her shirt to use as wet cloths for covering the containers. The work absorbed them completely, as if motion itself could keep the fear away. Outside, the villagers moved quietly around the newcomers. Raphael and Carter stayed near the entrance, watching the river and the tree line. The sky was heavy with gray clouds again, and the smell of rain carried through the air. "They'll come looking," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. Raphael nodded. "But not yet. They'll wait for the flood to ease. The river will hide our trail for now." Dillon sat near the doorway, his injured arm resting on his knee. Amy handed him a cup of tea that one of the villagers had brought. It tasted bitter, like bark and smoke, but it helped steady his nerves. Catherine joined him, setting her camera on the floor. "You got the photos?" he asked. She nodded. "Most of them. Some files might be corrupted from the water, but enough survived." She hesitated before adding, "It feels strange, doesn't it? We came here looking for adventure, and now we're hiding in a hut with wounded people and dying animals." Dillon managed a faint smile. Adventure always sounds better before it starts. As the afternoon deepened, the hut filled with the soft rustle of movement, the scraping of wood, the faint croaks of frogs, the whisper of rain on the roof. Lucas worked tirelessly, his hands steady despite his exhaustion. He had improvised a small heating area using metal trays and candles, enough to warm the reptiles that needed higher temperatures. Malik sorted the plant samples, separating the viable ones from those too damaged to survive. Catherine filmed fragments of their work, her lens lingering not on faces, but on gestures. The way Malik's fingers handled a leaf as though it were sacred. The way Lucas leaned close to listen for the heartbeat of a tiny mammal. She wasn't thinking of views or audiences anymore. The camera had become a witness, nothing more. By nightfall, the storm returned. The wind tore through the palms and the rain drummed against the thatched roof like an unending rhythm. They sealed the hut's shutters and lit a few lanterns. The light painted the walls in flickering gold and shadow. Amy sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking softly with one of the village children who had slipped inside out of curiosity. The boy pointed at the crates and asked questions she couldn't understand, but she smiled anyway. For the first time since they'd arrived in the jungle, she felt something close to calm. Carter took a seat beside the door, his back against the wall. The fatigue in his bones was deep, the kind that comes from fear stretched over too many hours. Raphael dozed near him, his machete still within reach. Through the gaps in the shutters, Carter could see the faint reflection of lightning over the river. He thought about the men they had escaped, the traffickers who would wake to find their cash gone, their profits vanished. They would not simply accept the loss. Someone would have to answer for it. And, in the lawless sprawl of the Amazon, there were no courts, no police to intervene. Only the jungle, which remembered everything but spoke to no one. When dawn came again, it was a muted gray, heavy with mist. They began preparations to move. Raphael had arranged for a local contact to ferry them downstream to a larger settlement where there was a wildlife rehabilitation post managed by volunteers from an environmental organization. It would take nearly a day by boat, but the animals needed proper care soon. They loaded the crates carefully, the villagers helping silently, their faces solemn. As they worked, the older man who had given them shelter approached Carter. He spoke in slow Portuguese, his words soft but grave. Raphael translated. He says, "The men you escaped from have been seen before. They use the river to move their shipments. Sometimes the forest gives them warning. Sometimes it doesn't." The man placed a hand on Carter's shoulder and added something else. Raphael hesitated, then said quietly, "He says the forest remembers those who try to protect it." They departed just after sunrise. The river was calmer now, smooth as glass in some places, raging in others. The boat they had borrowed was smaller than before, its motor weaker, but it moved steadily. The hours passed slowly, the jungle sliding by in endless green walls. The air grew hotter as the sun climbed, the mist burning away into light. Dylan dozed, his face pale but peaceful. Amy kept her eyes on the horizon, as if expecting something to rise from the water at any moment. Catherine sat near the front, her camera resting on her lap but turned off. She didn't want to record this part. The silence, the exhaustion, the aftermath. By late afternoon, they reached the outpost. It wasn't much, a collection of wooden platforms connected by narrow bridges, perched over the water like a floating village. A handful of people waited there, dressed in simple uniforms, marked with the green emblem of an environmental organization. One of them, a woman in her 40s with weathered hands and kind eyes, greeted Raphael with familiarity. She listened as he explained what had happened, her expression growing more serious by the moment. When Carter showed her the crates, she nodded and motioned for her team to help carry them inside. The rescued animals were moved to a shaded enclosure, where veterinarians began examining them immediately. The group stood by, watching in silence as the professionals took over. Malik felt a strange mixture of pride and grief. He had fought so hard to save them, and now that they were safe, he didn't know what to do with his hands. Lucas leaned on the railing, staring at the water below. Catherine took one last photograph, a simple shot of the crates being opened, a hand releasing a small trembling frog into a shallow tank. She lowered the camera afterward and turned it off for good. That evening, they sat together on the platform as the sun dipped behind the trees, the sky burning orange and purple. The air was still, except for the buzz of insects and the gentle lapping of water. The woman from the outpost brought them food and tea and thanked them for what they had done. She told them quietly that she had heard rumors of the same trafficking network for years, but never had enough evidence to act. "You've given us something to work with," she said. "Maybe now we can stop them." Carter nodded but said nothing. He knew the fight would be far from over. When night fell, the outpost lights flickered on, small halos in the darkness. For the first time in days, they slept without fear. Yet, even in rest, their dreams were filled with echoes of the jungle. The crash of rain, the cries of unseen birds, the gleam of eyes watching from the dark. The Amazon was vast and alive, and it held its secrets tightly. But somewhere out there, beneath the endless canopy, a scar remained where the hatch had been, where the ground still carried the faint imprint of their footprints and the story they had buried there along with the contraband they had uncovered. The price of rescue had been high. Wounds, fear, the weight of guilt and responsibility. But as the river whispered beyond the wooden walls and the first dawn birds began to sing, each of them understood in their own way that what they had done mattered. Perhaps not to the world at large, not in headlines or applause, but to the creatures whose tiny hearts still beat because they had chosen to stay. The jungle would remember them as it always did, quietly, without words, in the endless rhythm of its living breath. The morning mist lifted slowly from the river, rising in delicate ribbons that caught the first pale light. The group woke to the sound of engines from the outpost's small fleet of patrol boats, each marked with the green emblem of the environmental organization. The place that had seemed fragile and hidden the night before now looked purposeful, a base of quiet resistance, half clinic and half command post. Carter stood on the wooden deck overlooking the water, his hand resting on the railing. He watched as volunteers loaded boxes and equipment, their movements efficient and calm. It struck him how ordinary everything appeared. After the chaos of the past days, normalcy itself felt surreal. Inside the main hut, Malik and Lucas worked with the staff to transfer the rescued animals into clean tanks and cages. The air was cool and smelled faintly of antiseptic and river clay. The frogs, once barely moving, now stirred under the careful hands of the veterinarians. The small mammals had been given food and were beginning to eat again. It was a slow miracle unfolding in front of them, fragile but real. Catherine watched through her camera lens, recording in silence. This time, she wasn't framing the story for beauty or rhythm. She was capturing evidence, each shot a testimony of survival. The woman who managed the outpost, Dr. Isabel Mendez, sat at a rough wooden table surrounded by maps, notebooks, and a single aging laptop. Her face bore the calm authority of someone used to balancing urgency and patience. When Carter and Raphael joined her, she gestured for them to sit. She listened to their account of the cache and the traffickers, interrupting only to ask for coordinates or dates. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard as she typed, her brow furrowed. "We've suspected operations like this for years," she said finally, her voice low but sharp, "but proof has always disappeared. Until now." Catherine entered quietly and placed a flash drive on the table. "All the photos and footage," she said. Isabel took it without a word, connecting it to the laptop. The screen filled with images, the metal hatch, the crates, the markings in Portuguese and Latin, the exhausted animals. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then Isabel exhaled. "This is enough," she said. "Enough to start an investigation. Enough to make noise." But even as she said it, her tone held caution. Malik noticed it immediately. "You're afraid they'll bury it, aren't you?" he asked. Isabel met his gaze. "They've done it before. Local officials are often part of the chain. Once we send this information up the line, it could vanish. That's why we don't just report it. We share it." She explained the plan. The outpost had a direct communication line with international conservation networks and a contact in a global NGO headquartered in Geneva. They would send copies of the data to multiple servers simultaneously: photos, coordinates, and witness accounts. If one was silenced, the others would remain. Carter listened carefully, his hand unconsciously tightening around the railing of the chair. The strategy was sound, but it also meant exposure. Once the traffickers realized what had been shared, they would trace it back to the source. By midday, the team gathered to prepare the transmissions. Dylan sat near the back, his arm still bandaged but his focus sharp. He and Isabel worked to stabilize the weak satellite connection, rerouting the signal through 2 relay points. Malik verified each file twice. Catherine uploaded her photographs in silence, her eyes following the progress bar inching across the screen. When it reached completion, a faint chime sounded. Isabel smiled faintly. "It's done," she said. "They can't erase it now." The relief that followed was almost physical, a weight lifted from every chest. Amy laughed softly for the first time in days. "So that's it?" she asked. "We send it, and they're finished?" Isabel shook her head. "It's a beginning, but beginnings are the hardest part." Later, as dusk began to fall, the outpost stirred with new tension. A radio transmission arrived, static and fragments of a warning. Raphael, translating rapidly, said the words they'd all feared. 2 boats had been seen heading upriver, the same route they had taken. They bore no insignia, and their engines were larger than the ones used by traders. Isabel's calm cracked for a moment. "They'll come here," she said. "They'll want what you took from them, and they'll want to know who talked." Carter stood immediately. "Then we need to move." Isabel shook her head. "If you leave now, they'll follow. Better to make them think we're prepared." She turned to her staff, issuing quick orders. The outpost changed in minutes, from sanctuary to fortress. Lanterns were doused. The patrol boats were pulled to the far dock. A handful of volunteers armed themselves with flare guns and machetes. The rescued animals were moved to the interior storage huts, hidden beneath tarps. Night fell completely. The jungle's voice grew louder again, the hum of insects swelling until it seemed to fill the world. The group waited in near darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the laptop screen as Isabel monitored the satellite feed. At one point, Catherine thought she heard the distant drone of engines over the water. She turned toward the sound, her heart pounding. Then, silence. Hours passed. When the noise came again, it was closer, distinct. 2 motors cutting through the current. Carter whispered a command, and the lanterns were extinguished completely. The outpost sank into shadow. Through the narrow gaps between boards, they could see the faint reflections of light on the river, search beams sweeping the banks. The traffickers had arrived. The boats drifted slowly, pausing near the main dock. Voices carried over the water, harsh and accented. One called out, demanding a response. Raphael whispered to Carter that they were pretending to be traders looking for fuel. Isabel gestured for silence. The voices grew louder, more impatient. Then a flare burst above the river, lighting the scene in stark red. Shadows jumped across the trees, and for a moment they were exposed. Carter's pulse thudded in his ears. He motioned for everyone to stay low. The boats circled once, their lights scanning the huts. One beam lingered on the main building. For a terrible moment, it seemed that they would come ashore. But then, from farther down the river, another light appeared, a patrol boat from the regional station, drawn by the flare. The traffickers hesitated, shouted something to one another, then turned sharply downstream. Within minutes, the engines faded into distance. When the last echo died away, the group remained frozen. Only after Isabel whispered, "They're gone," did anyone move. Amy sank to the floor, her breath shuddering out in relief. Mullock leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Carter looked at Isabel. "How long before they come again?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, "Long enough for your story to reach people who can't ignore it." The following days blurred into motion. News spread faster than anyone expected. International channels picked up the story. Illegal wildlife trade network exposed in Amazon region. The photographs Catherine had taken appeared online and in print, stripped of names but unmistakable in their detail. The footage of the rescued animals being treated at the outpost played in short clips across networks. The organization's headquarters released a statement calling for immediate investigation by both Brazilian authorities and international conservation agencies. For the first time, their fight had a face. Not heroes, not adventurers, but witnesses. And yet, the cost lingered. The traffickers' network began to fracture. Some members arrested, others disappearing into the interior. Rumors spread of informants silenced. Carter and his group were advised to remain under protection at the outpost until the situation cooled. Isabel arranged communication with officials abroad who could handle their statements remotely. In those quiet days, reflection replaced adrenaline. Lucas spent his hours assisting the veterinarians, caring for the survivors. Malik kept notes on the plants, planning to send his findings to universities once it was safe. Catherine avoided the camera entirely, instead helping Amy catalog the documents they had taken. Dylan, though healing, spent time repairing the boat engines and maintaining equipment, routine tasks that gave him peace. And Carter, though restless, finally allowed himself to rest one evening, sitting on the dock watching the river glow under the rising moon. The world beyond the jungle had begun to stir because of what they had done. But the jungle itself remained indifferent, eternal. The night air was filled with its usual chorus, the rhythmic croaks, the buzz of wings, the whisper of wind moving through leaves. Carter listened, understanding that their part in the story was ending. The rest belonged to those who would come after, to the investigators, the journalists, the people who would build on what they had risked. Still, even as the sense of closure grew, unease lingered. He knew the traffickers' world too well to believe it would vanish overnight. Somewhere out there, behind the dense curtain of trees, someone was remembering their faces, their actions, and planning. But now, at least, the world was watching too. And that changed everything. On the fifth morning, a radio transmission arrived from the capital. The authorities had seized warehouses linked to the same network. Documents matching the codes from Catherine's photos were discovered, leading to a chain of arrests. Isabel read the message aloud, her voice steady but her eyes glimmering with relief. Amy covered her face with her hands. Malik smiled for the first time in days, though it was a small, tired smile. "It's not over," Isabel said quietly, "but it's a start." That night, under a clear sky filled with stars, the group gathered one last time by the dock. The air was warm, the river silver under the moonlight. The rescued animals slept in their new enclosures nearby, their breaths soft and steady. No one spoke for a while. Then Catherine lifted her head and said, almost to herself, "We didn't just save them. We saved ourselves from being the kind of people who look away." Carter nodded slowly. He looked out over the river where the current moved endlessly, carrying the fragments of branches and leaves toward the sea. "And we gave the forest a voice," he said, "even if it only whispers." The night stretched long and quiet after that. One by one, they drifted to sleep, some in hammocks, others on the deck beneath the open sky. The jungle hummed softly around them, vast and unchanging. Their story was no longer theirs alone. It had become part of something larger, woven into the endless pulse of the place that had tested, wounded, and, in a strange way, redeemed them. When dawn came, golden and slow, it touched the river like forgiveness. And far away, where the water met the horizon, it carried the faint echo of their names, lost but remembered, carried forward by the current. When they left the outpost, the morning was a mirror of the first day they had arrived in the Amazon. Quiet, heavy with heat, and alive with 1,000 unseen things whispering through the canopy. But now, the forest no longer looked like the beginning of an adventure. It looked like something behind them, vast and secret, a place that had taken its price and given something in return. Their boat moved slowly down the river, guided by one of Isabel's men, a wiry local named Paolo, who navigated as though he could read the current's language. The river stretched ahead, brown and endless, carrying them towards the nearest port town, where a small aircraft waited to take them home. No one spoke much at first. The sound of the motor and the hum of insects filled the air between them. Moloch sat near the bow, staring into the water where flashes of light rippled like silver scales. Lucas kept a hand on the crate beside him that contained the last of the plant specimens, healthy, cataloged, and soon to be studied by environmental scientists. Dylan's bandaged arm rested across his knees. The wound had scabbed, but the ache reminded him constantly that some scars don't fade as easily as skin. Amy watched the jungle drift past, her expression a mixture of relief and guilt. She couldn't shake the thought that not everyone had made it out of that forest alive. The traffickers' faces still appeared in her dreams, blurred by rain and red light. Catherine, as always, had her camera ready but rarely lifted it. She seemed to be searching for one last image that could sum up everything, but none of the frames felt right anymore. By late afternoon, they reached the port town. It was little more than a scattering of corrugated roofs and muddy streets, but to them, it looked like civilization reborn. Children ran barefoot near the docks, shouting in Portuguese. A woman sold grilled fish from a stand beside the water, and the smell made Amy's stomach twist with hunger. They hadn't eaten properly in days. Raphael handled the papers at the small immigration office, explaining their route and showing Isabel's authorization letter. The official, a weary man with kind eyes, looked them over, clearly guessing there was more to their story than what he was told. But he stamped the papers without question. The plane that would take them to Manaus was small, a twin-engine propeller aircraft, its paint faded and its wings streaked with dirt. They loaded their few belongings carefully. Catherine's camera bag, Dylan's notebook, Moloch's samples, Lucas's field journal, and a single crate containing 2 surviving animals, a small capuchin monkey and a rare emerald lizard. The rest had already been transferred to the rescue facility. When the plane lifted off, The jungle unfolded beneath them, a vast green ocean broken only by winding rivers and occasional scars of cleared land. None of them spoke as the forest disappeared behind clouds. In Manaus, the transition to the modern world was abrupt. The city buzzed with traffic, neon lights, and noise. The air smelled of fuel instead of earth. They were met at the airport by representatives from the environmental organization who ushered them into vans and drove them to a hotel overlooking the Rio Negro. For the first time in weeks, they slept in clean sheets and under steady air conditioning. Yet, sleep brought no peace. Carter woke in the middle of the night to the sound of rain against glass. Thinking for a moment he was back in the clearing. Catherine dreamed of the hatch opening endlessly, revealing more and more layers beneath the earth. Malik saw the eyes of the animals they couldn't save. The next morning, the organization held a press briefing. Isabel joined by video from the outpost, her image grainy but her voice steady. Reporters filled the room, their faces eager, curious, skeptical. Carter stood beside her, still uncomfortable under the bright lights. When asked what had driven them to risk their lives, he hesitated. "Because someone had to," he said finally. "We found something buried that should have never been hidden, and once you see it, you can't just turn away." Malik spoke next, describing the condition of the animals and the evidence of trafficking. Catherine played a short clip of the footage, the moment the hatch opened and the flashlight beam revealed the crates. The room fell silent. The story spread faster than they imagined. Within a day, major outlets carried it across continents. Illegal biodiversity trade uncovered in Amazon by former students. Their names appeared in headlines, though they hadn't wanted that. The footage was aired on television and shared online, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Environmental groups used it to pressure governments into tightening wildlife protection laws. For a moment, it felt as though they had changed something real. But fame came with its shadow. Emails poured in, some thanking them, others threatening. Carter received anonymous messages warning him to stay quiet. Catherine's footage was used by activists, but also by smugglers trying to track who had leaked it. Malik's university department demanded clarification about his unsanctioned research. Amy's social media accounts were flooded with accusations that they had fabricated the story for publicity. Lucas, the most private of them all, deleted his accounts entirely. They had wanted to expose the truth, not to become part of a spectacle. Within a week, security was arranged for them. They were advised to stay in Brazil until the investigation concluded. Isabel kept them informed from the outpost. Arrests had been made in nearby provinces, but some suspects had vanished deeper into the forest. The cache they discovered was only one of many. "You opened a door," she said in one of her messages. "Now others will have to walk through it." As the days passed, their unity began to fray. The tension that had held them together in danger now turned into quiet disagreements. Malik wanted to return to the field to help identify other potential sites. Dylan insisted they'd done enough and should return home. Amy cried one night in the hotel lobby, saying she wished they'd never gone on the trip. Lucas argued that it wasn't about wishing. It was about bearing the weight of what they now knew. Carter tried to keep peace, but even he felt the exhaustion creeping into his bones. The jungle had given them purpose, but the world was trying to take it away piece by piece. One evening, Catherine wandered down to the river alone. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and wet stone. She carried her camera, but didn't use it. Across the water, lights shimmered from boats anchored offshore, their reflections trembling in the current. She thought of the night on the boat after they escaped, The way the darkness had seemed endless. The way Carter's voice had steadied them when they thought they wouldn't make it. She realized then that no photograph could ever capture what mattered most. The truth wasn't in images. It was in the silence between them, in the choices that had cost them sleep and comfort, but given life to creatures no one else would ever see. A few days later, they were cleared to travel home. They said goodbye to Isabel at the small regional office. She hugged each of them in turn, her expression proud and tired. "The forest doesn't forget," she said quietly, "but it forgives those who protect it." Carter didn't know whether he believed in forgiveness anymore, but he nodded anyway. The flight back to the United States was long, passing through night and dawn again before landing. They parted ways in the arrivals hall with awkward embraces and promises to stay in touch. Malik returned to his lab where the samples would soon be studied. Catherine was approached by a documentary network, though she wasn't sure she'd accept. Dylan went home to his family, determined to stay away from the wild for a while. Amy disappeared for several weeks, traveling to visit her mother in Atlanta. Lucas took a teaching position in a small coastal town, his lectures about biodiversity now carrying an unspoken edge of warning. Carter stayed behind in Washington for the debriefings. The agencies wanted his testimony, and the organization wanted his help drafting proposals for stronger conservation laws. But when the meetings ended and the rooms emptied, he felt restless. The city's order, the straight lines of its streets, the sterile hum of offices, felt too clean. The jungle had been dangerous, unpredictable, but it had been alive. He missed its weight, its voice, even its fear. Months passed. The case made headlines again when an international task force announced the dismantling of a major trafficking network spanning multiple countries. Carter watched the report on television, seeing the same photographs Catherine had taken flash across the screen. He turned off the sound and stood by the window, watching rain streak down the glass. Somewhere, far away, he imagined the river still flowing, washing away the tracks of those who had run through its mud. One night, a small package arrived at his door. No return address, only a postmark from Brazil. Inside was a photograph, one Catherine must have taken after all. It showed the clearing at dawn, mist rising from the trees, the spot where the hatch had been now covered by fresh soil and a thin carpet of green. On the back, she had written, "It's healing. Maybe we can too." He pinned the photo to the wall above his desk and stared at it for a long time. The forest looked peaceful, but he knew better than to believe it had forgotten. The jungle remembered everything. Every voice, every betrayal, every small act of defiance. It was both grave and cradle, keeper of secrets and giver of second chances. He wondered whether it remembered them not as intruders, but as witnesses who tried, for once, to do the right thing. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and soft. Somewhere, far beyond the city's edge, a river carried the reflection of the sky through a labyrinth of roots and shadows. In that endless motion, Carter thought, there was a kind of truth. You could leave the jungle, but it never truly left you. It followed in the quiet moments, in the smell of wet earth after rain, in the sound of wind whispering through trees. And perhaps that was its final gift, to remind those who survived it that saving something wild was not a victory, but a promise. He sat back and closed his eyes, hearing in memory the voice of Isabel, calm and certain. The forest remembers those who protect it. And for the first time since they had returned, Carter let himself believe that she was right. If this story kept you watching, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's another incredible story coming tomorrow, and plenty more waiting for you right now on the channel. Share this video with someone who loves real-life mysteries and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.